Welcome everybody to this webinar by the Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C, which is part of the American Nuclear Society's Standards Committee. My name is Prasad Kadambi. I am chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about with purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches, and the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act has specifically made reference to RIPB approaches. There's a lot of guidance available on this subject, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things we do, including standards development. Right now, after more than 2 years of conducting these community of practice sessions and having recordings of all these sessions on the RP3C website, I see ANS as a knowledge center on RIPB approaches that anybody can use in order to get better acquainted with the concepts and methods. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from what I would call as the source of a lot of the thinking that has gone into the rulemaking associated with Part 53, the Advanced Reactor Rulemaking. Bill Reckley is going to be presenting it. But before we get into it, I just want to mention our RP3C community of practice sessions are usually on the last Friday of every month. Coming up in November and December, the last Friday is, is just too close to the holidays. And so we are going to take a break, and we will resume the community of practice sessions in January of 2023. So with that, Bill, I don't think I need to introduce you, but if you want, you can get started by just introducing yourself and your role at the NRC. Thank you. Bill, go ahead. Bill, you're on mute.
Bill, I think we heard you for a second and you're back on mute.
Let's see, we were...
I got it. Is that
okay.
do it?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Great.
Okay. And now I need to reshare my screen, I guess. So again, as I try to do this. Damn thing. There we go. So my name again is Bill Reckley with the Advanced Reactor Policy Branch. We're the ones developing Part 53. So because we're kind of compressed on time, I wanted to jump in quickly and provide some background. So if you're going to try to understand Part 53, to some degree, you need to understand from where we came. So looking at a traditional safety case, and this is primarily what we would describe as the Part 50 approach. It really, and I'll tie it in where I can to ANS. This ties back to the ANS standards 51.1 and 52.1 in the 70s and 80s. And you can see that basically the safety case was largely developed by addressing a defined set of conditions that challenged the plant. They were divided into anticipated operational occurrences, design basis accidents. There was a calculation done of a major accident for siting purposes using a source term actually developed in the early 1960s, TID 14844. And then over time, as experience was gained in the 60s and 70s and 80s up to current day, where necessary, additional requirements would be added to the regulations. And so the primary examples given of those are station blackout and anticipated transients without scram. So that kind of is where Part 50 came. And if you look at most safety analysis reports for operating plants, it's going to follow that kind of structure. And you can see in Chapter 15, the accident analysis or safety analysis, you can see how they reflect those ANS standards 51.1 and 52.1. Then over time, as we moved into Part 52 and looked at the potential to regulate another generation of plants, it was an opportunity to expand on the safety case, to incorporate commission policy statements that were developed in the 1980s on severe accidents, advanced reactors, and the safety goal policy statement. We also addressed policy statements from the 90s on probabilistic risk assessment. And so in the end, Part 52 plants will look a lot like Part 50 in terms of the safety analysis, still have anticipated operational occurrences, very similar design basis accidents. There was progress made over the years. So instead of the TID document, maybe alternate source terms, a little less conservative, would have been used in the siting analysis. And then in Chapter 19 of the safety analysis reports, you would have seen reflected the requirements to provide a probabilistic risk assessment, or PRA, and to address severe accident design features in Chapter 19. Again, severe accident design features coming out of the Commission's severe accident policy statement from the 80s. So then in the late 2000 teens, 2017 or so, it did appear that there would be potential interest in other advanced reactor designs, and in particular non-light water reactor designs. And so the NRC started to prepare and develop implementing strategies. And one of the things we needed to kind of fall back and go back to first principles, because Part 50 and Part 52 are so light water reactor centric that it's very hard in many cases to simply use those requirements for other technologies. And so we use a slide such as this or variations of it to just basically show that one thing that all reactors have in common is basically the hazard, which is the radioactive materials produced from operation. And the ultimate goal to prevent the release of that radioactive material to the environment. So that is performed by a system of barriers, usually associated with the fuel, might add an additional barrier related to matrix, whether it be graphite or coolant in the case of molten salt or even liquid metal. Some kind of primary system barrier, be it the primary helium circuit or the primary reactor coolant pressure boundary, and then some other barrier of a building. And the requirements as it was constructed for light water reactors became very specific on addressing, for example, protections of the fuel clad, protections of the reactor coolant pressure boundary, and protections of the containment, being an essentially leak tight building. So one of the things we did immediately was to start to address some of those, because some of those issues were addressed in regulations and policy, and we needed to make some progress there. So things like the use of mechanistic source term, and that in turn would allow for the consideration of functional containment. Those issues ultimately were not really put to bed until that time frame, 2018, 2019. And then it also included making sure the commission was comfortable with risk-informed approaches. So the licensing modernization project on this slide really forms much of the basis for at least part of our development of Part 53. And this is how we explained it in the rulemaking plan for Part 53, that we basically have a methodology, and you can trace back the licensing modernization project guidance and a lot of work that was done involving industry, the Department of Energy, ultimately submitted in NEI 1804, risk-informed performance-based way to establish the licensing basis for non-light water reactors. But before that, it built off of the next generation nuclear plant. It built off of the efforts in the early 2000s, such as New Reg 1860, and an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in 2006 that reflects some of the same thoughts that we're doing now in Part 53, or proposing to do in Part 53. And just last in the evolution there, or where to some degree it began, was much of this methodology was developed and first proposed for the modular high temperature gas cooled reactor back in the 1980s. So it is important to keep in context this evolution, because one of the reasons that we adopted it in Part 53, and one of the reasons the Commission said that we could develop Part 53 on the schedule that was established, was because we were going to build from this legacy. And so that leads us then into Part 53. And as most of you know, if you've been listening to past community practices or to our public meetings at the NRC, Part 53 is currently divided into two frameworks. We started out with subparts A through K, and again, that follows largely a framework that's built off of using the licensing modernization project output NEI 1804 and Reg Guide 1.233 as kind of the background, as one acceptable way that could have been implemented, based on feedback largely related to developers who said that they needed a framework that was more comparable to international standards and the related regulatory systems in other countries, including that implemented by the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. They wanted a more traditional framework. And so we took that to heart and developed Framework B, which is a more traditional approach. So I'll get into this a little bit more in the presentation. So starting with Framework A, and I apologize for how busy the slide is, but I was joking to Prasad earlier. It's amazing that people want things explained simply, and we try to do the best we can. But these are complex topics, and there's a lot of interactions and a lot of moving parts. So it's unfortunately some of the slides get busy when you're trying to explain them. So I'm going to start on the right of this slide, and you'll see the chevrons. And within Framework A, these form a hierarchy of requirements that step through, and we consistently use them throughout all the subparts. And they are, you have high-level safety criteria. You have then requirements, and basically within Framework A, the majority of the actual technical requirements are right here on this slide, because the safety criteria are defined, and then everything else is a requirement for the applicant to assess and identify safety functions. So these are traditionally control reactivity, control heat production, control heat removal. And we expect them to be the same under Part 53, but we don't define them. The applicant would say, in order to meet these safety criteria in the middle of the slide, I need these safety functions. From safety functions, then we require that the applicant identify design features that would meet those safety functions. So this is the actual hardware. What are the systems that are going to do that? And then ultimately down to the level of what are the design attributes, what's the functional design criteria for that equipment. So this is where you start getting down to what is the amount of heat removal that'll be necessary, what's the flow rates, what's the efficiencies of filters and so forth by the time you get down to the bottom. But that's up for applicants to decide. The next thing to address is in the middle, to say the actual safety objectives. And these are defined in somewhat traditional terms and somewhat new terms. So the first one, well, the first is the safety objectives themselves. And there are two: no immediate threat to public health and safety. And the second one is that additional measures be considered based on the potential risk insights from PRA or other evaluations. So that then gets implemented through the specific criteria, and I just listed them and given the proposed rule number there. 210 is safety criteria for DBAs, design basis accidents. That would look familiar. Those are the traditional 25 rem at the exclusionary boundary or low population zone boundary. Then safety criteria for licensing basis events other than design basis accidents. And this addresses things like defense in depth. It reflects things like the frequency consequence curve shown at the bottom of that box. So this is where you would include evaluation criteria for each licensing basis event, each event sequence, or classes such as anticipated operational occurrences, or under LNP, it was a design basis event. We call it an unlikely event, and or beyond design basis events under LNP, which we call very unlikely event sequences. And then lastly, within that category of other licensing basis events is the measure or the requirement to address a cumulative risk measure, for which we use the NRC safety goal policy statement, and more specifically the QHOs, the quantitative health objectives. So the use of the QHOs has been one of the topics that's gotten the most discussions. We just want to emphasize that the QHOs are considered in total with other performance standards that are listed there, and not used in any way to be a sole measure of adequate protection of public health and safety. That last thing on this slide is the box at the bottom, which, although it's kind of in the form of a footnote, is kind of important insofar as the NRC's goal and function is basically given in the box. Our mandate under the Atomic Energy Act is to ensure that when a licensed nuclear power plant it goes into operation, that there is adequate protection of public health and safety. But over the years, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has not specifically defined what that means, other than to say for the operating fleet, the evolution of requirements from the 1960s up to present day, when looked in total, can be presumed to provide adequate protection of public health and safety. So that's important because as we develop Framework A, one of the requirements that we need to fulfill is to show there's a comparable level of safety. And I'll get to that in the next slide. All I wanted to show in this slide, since we need to be quick here, and I'm probably already talking too much, is an example of going through those chevrons from the highest level safety criteria down through safety functions, design features, and functional design criteria. This is a very old slide from the days of the modular high temperature gas cooled reactor. But you can see basically this exercise. And for me, anyway, when you look at this figure, I think the similarity to the objectives hierarchy that Prasad has mentioned is immediately evident. So basically, it's the same type of an exercise where you start off on what are the ends that I'm trying to achieve. And so that's the safety criteria. And as you work your way down, you're going to get into more and more detail about the means that you're going to satisfy and meet the ends. That is one of the things we wanted to point out here. There's been some discussion of whether Part 53 is performance-based. My own personal opinion is, given that the requirements only set out the macro ends, which are the safety criteria, and leaves the flexibility to designers or other applicants on how they're going to do that, from what functions they're going to fulfill down to what design features they're going to use to do them. I think that flexibility is one of the things that we set out to do, and one of the things that actually um, reflects how performance-based the approach is. Going back to my last statement on the footnote on the other slide about adequate protection, how do you compare two different frameworks? And so one of the tools that we use in making routine licensing decisions over the last 20 years or more than that actually, has been an integrated decision-making model that's reflected in Reg Guide 1174. And so we're trying to use the same kind of a logic. One has to be a little careful. 1174 was developed to evaluate changes in the existing licensing basis of operating plants, but the logic is good, and it can be just expanded and looked at slightly differently to say, let's use that same thought process to compare the two frameworks. And so just going quickly around, you basically look at what are the overall requirements, what are they addressing, and we think that you can basically do that comparison. Parts 50, 52, and 53 is going to focus much on how do you both prevent and mitigate unplanned events. Much of the requirements you can draw parallels. Defense in depth. Part 53, Framework A in particular, has specific provisions for the assessment of defense in depth. In Part 50, defense in depth is built in. You look through the GDC and it will, the various criteria within the general design criteria provide that defense in depth. Without having that in Framework A, we require an assessment of defense in depth, but it achieves the same ends. Design requirements, including margins for SS structure systems and components, addressed in the engineering requirements in Part 53. Risk metrics, including consideration of the NRC safety goals, and in particular the QHOs. And then lastly, to make sure that whatever you put in place has appropriate monitoring of the actual performance. So this is kind of the exercise we went through in developing. These are familiar slides for those that's worked with or read the licensing modernization. Under Framework A, the safety classifications are safety related, non-safety related, but safety significant and non-safety significant. The importance of this is that safety classification is the vehicle by which you start to segment items to treat them differently. And that is one way you come up with a performance-based approach, is to make a distinction between what needs to meet the full pedigree of Appendix B under Part 50, the quality assurance requirements, and what SSCs you are providing flexibility to designers to address, but not necessarily needing to meet that full pedigree. So you need classifications or different buckets to put things in so that you can actually provide the flexibility to licensees. Framework B uses the existing structure, safety related and important to safety. It also includes the equivalent of 5069 that would allow risk-informed classification of SSCs. One quick point on defense in depth. Another thing that we've tried to do in Part 53 is to look at everything in an integrated fashion. So even the structure of Part 53 is laid out kind of using a systems engineer approach, which goes from the beginning and the design criteria, the highest level functional criteria, and then goes through the life cycle of the facility. So one of the things we try to recognize is that defense in depth, for example, when you look at it in an integrated fashion, you can consider not only the hardware, the plant capability in this LMP figure, but also the programmatic requirements. And if you're doing this in a holistic or integrated manner, it allows at the design stage for people to already be considering what is the performance monitoring I'm going to do, and to be a little more conscious of how they might consider that and actually take advantage of it during licensing. So, my classic example is if there's an uncertainty associated with a pipe, I can try to address it totally within the design. I can encase the pipe in another pipe, or I can make it thicker or stronger. But I can also address some of those uncertainties through things like inspection programs and monitoring programs. And so, and we do this now. This is not rocket science. You're always going to do this, but if you're more conscious about it and saying, here's my uncertainties and here's what needs to be put in place, both in design and programmatic requirements, you can just come up with a more efficient way of doing it, other than to say, maybe what we've more traditionally done was convince us that you've addressed it by the design. And once you've satisfied, we'll then say, but you still have to monitor it. So you really, in historical terms, usually get both, and you'll get both under Part 53. We're just hoping that there'll be a more logical decision-making process about what you're addressing in design and what you're addressing in programmatic requirements. I did, this is just kind of a quick mention. One of the things that we did do in Part 53 that is a new item is within both frameworks in the manufacturing license sections, we've added provisions that would allow the loading of fuel into a module that could then be transported. So this is looking ahead. DOE basically has their nuclear energy program kind of laid out in terms of a multi-pronged approach. Big reactors, the Vogtle 3 and 4, the potential that there could be more of those, the medium level, including some of the non-light water reactor designs, the hundreds of megawatt ranges that could be used for various purposes, including replacing mid-level fossil stations, and then the micro reactors that could address certain markets. So a lot of discussion about that. One of the things that people thought was that it would be advantageous to actually load them in a factory. So we included provisions in Part 53 to specifically address that contingency. So I did want to mention quickly Framework B. Again, since I've been mainly associated with Framework A, that gives my bias and why I spent a little more time on that. But Framework B is equally important. It does use a traditional approach, as I mentioned. But one of the things that it does in Framework B is it takes and introduces technology inclusive approaches to the traditional requirements. And by doing that, you almost inherently make them somewhat performance based. You're offering flexibility. You need to be less prescriptive because it needs to address a range of technologies. So the safety case will look familiar, it just doesn't have the specificity that's in Part 50. So the siting analysis still requires the identification of a major accident. We just don't provide the source term. That would be for the applicant to justify, to identify and justify. The initiating events and accident analysis, again, look very familiar. Design basis accidents, we're just not identifying the double-ended guillotine brake as the DBA. It's again, the designer will have to look, identify a design basis accident. And same with anticipated operational occurrences. There's a requirement to address additional licensing basis events. We're trying to avoid some of the confusion that's been introduced by using the term beyond design basis events or beyond design basis accidents, calling them additional licensing basis events. This would be the equivalent of the special events in ANS 30.3, the equivalent of design extension conditions in the IAEA guidance. And again, just basically people are familiar with what these are: station blackout, anticipated transit without scram, any technology specific ones that are identified. Just trying to change the terminology to avoid some of the confusion, but it's the same animal. Severe accidents, and then introduced in both frameworks A and B is the need to address chemical hazards that might accompany a radiological release. Then another item in framework B talks about containments, and for light water reactors, the expectation is they would continue to use an essentially leak-tight containment structure. But also introduced in framework B is the notion of functional containment and the reliance on barriers, be the fuel structure itself or some other approach. Just the note there on the right, since talking about framework B, since it took much of the requirements from the existing parts 50 and 52, where those items in 50 and 52 were developed specifically to include a performance-based or risk-informed approach, they would come over and provide that in framework B as well. And the maintenance rule would be an example. Both framework A and framework B have the equivalent of the maintenance rule, and it's basically copied over from the requirements in part 50. Talk about staffing, right? The operation of a nuclear power plant, I say, is the plant, the people, and the programs. And the people are a very important part. So there is in subpart F a requirement that, or the requirements that are currently in part 50, and also all the requirements that are currently for staffing in part 55. And again, this is somewhat novel in that we're not in part 53 proposing to provide specific things like numbers of operators or the specific role of people. We come back to the hierarchy and say, here are the safety criteria, the safety functions, and then you can just replace what's the role of a pump with what's the role of a person. And given you've identified a role for the person, what needs to be done to support that responsibility being put on the person. So you have to do the human factors engineering to say that the person can do their job. If they need to know what a flow rate is, then you have to have an indication of the flow rate. That's human factors engineering, right? On Bill's dumb level. Then You need to look at the human system interfaces. If you're going to assign a person to close a valve, they have to have access to the valve. They have to develop a concept of operations that basically defines what are the role of people in running the plant. D is what I just talked about, the functional requirements analysis to say what needs to be done, what's the role of the machine, what's the role of people, and so forth. And then they need to develop a staffing plan. So you take out the prescriptive requirements from 5054 and Part 55, and you basically say, here's what needs to be developed. They have the flexibility to do that and make their proposals in terms of what are, for example, the staffing plan. One really, to me, transformational element within Part 53 is that if you can go through this exercise and basically show that that because of passive and inherent features of the reactor, that people play a very little role, then you can use a generally licensed reactor operator. And under this scheme, this is where the NRC would not be conducting the licensing exams of reactor operators and senior reactor operators, but they would receive a NRC license based on the facility providing the training and doing the exams and so forth. And the last bullet there, within Part 53, we really stress the importance of a systems approach to training. Then one other item in Framework B, we received feedback that there may be approaches to risk informing the requirements that would not require a PRA. So within Framework B, there is a provision that says a risk evaluation needs to be done. It can be done using a PRA, or it can be done using an alternative evaluation for risk insights that really looks at a bounding event type approach. The use of the ARI provision, we have some criteria for who could use that. They have to show that there's a limited offsite dose for a bounding event. And then they have to do a systematic look at what are the radionuclides, what are the hazards, what's the role of various active, passive, and inherent structure systems and components, and what's the potential contribution of human errors. There's guidance available, or draft guidance that is available in DG 1413 for how to do a systematic look at events, and then DG 1414, which is actually on how to use ARI principles in general. And then last slide, as you can imagine, going through all of that, there's a lot of guidance that is being worked on and will be worked on in the future. I mentioned quite a few times the licensing modernization program, NEI 1804, Reg Guide 1.233. That's carrying through with some of the top lines here you see on things like content to applications. That'll be in NEI 2107 that builds off of the LMP. A lot of other work like ASME standards and so forth. And then down the road, you know, as we get further into this, there'll be, I think we'll likely identify a lot of other guidance documents that'll need to be done. So with that, Pat, I tried to leave 10 minutes or so here for questions if there's been people putting on the chat.
Pat, you're muted.
Yeah, Bill, you did a great job. Perfect timing. We do have a few questions. Ronnie has been very good about indicating what slide the questions are on. So I will go ahead. Her first question is on slide 4. And she said that, Bill, you had mentioned in the 2018 timeframe that NRC staff needed to ensure the commission was comfortable with risk-informed approaches. Was this not achieved in 20 years earlier when the commission endorsed SECI 98-144 and defined the risk terminology in its 1999 SRM?
Yeah, I might have shorthanded that. Obviously, commission policy has been to advocate risk-informed approaches since 2000. I meant more um, an LMP type approach, NEI 1804 type approach, where you're taking it really to the next level in terms of using the PRA to identify the licensing basis events. Although there was commission approval, for example, in 2003, that you could use a probabilistic approach to justify not using the single failure criterion, that had not been really tested, and discussions about pros and cons of requiring the single failure criteria kind of continued up to present day. And so the papers that we were providing, like 19117, was just to go back to the commission and say, you did previously say you were amenable to not using the single failure criteria. This methodology that we're about to undertake implements that. Same with mechanistic source term. It was needed to go back to them and say this approach, the use of the PRA and this kind of methodology is actually going to implement functional containment, which even up to that time frame was still a question mark in some people's minds as to whether the commission had ever said you don't need an essentially leak tight containment. So I misspoke in simplifying, but it's not so much the risk informed approach they needed to review, but the specifics of how far this went.
Thank you. Ronnie, does that cover it?
Yeah, Rani says, thanks for the clarification.
Okay.
Given the
Great.
time, let's go on to the next question, Pat.
So the next one is on slide 5, and Ronnie did thank you for the historical overview. It said that you indicated that Part 53 framework is built upon the 1980s legacy from HTGR, which presumably leveraged the prescriptive and deterministic constructs of that era. Why not a clean sheet focused on safety performance outcomes using RIPB principles that had not yet been established in the 1980s?
Well, what I was trying to say is that although it started then, and it was very novel at that time, it's continued to evolve over those many decades. So it started then, but it looks significantly different. And you're right. If you look at new Reg 1338 or new Reg 1368, which are shown here on the slides, these were the pre-application reviews of things like MHTGR and PRISM back in the day. There was a lot of light water reactor requirements that were built into that licensing approach. I think if you will look now at where we are in LMP and in Part 53, you will see that we've evolved past those, and we no longer default to, well, we'll do this just because that's the way it was done for the light water reactor fleet. So.
And I see Ronnie said thank you on that as well. So the next question is on slide 22. And that is a question on why are requirements for traditional containment structures applied to LWRs, and why is functional containment disallowed for LWRs and no exception request allowed, I guess.
Yeah, in the development of Framework B, and again, this went largely to why we undertook it, which was the request was people want to follow a basic structure, and in large part, that structure is what is included in international standards. We did really kind of bifurcate Framework B into light water reactors for which the requirements were already in place, and non-light waters for which it's not in place, and therefore, and for which you can really foresee a desire to use something like a functional containment. Even NuScale and most modern light water reactors or recent light water reactors include something may look different than the large concrete structures we're used to, but they basically aren't essentially leak tight containment. So it was just a mix of both capabilities to do in the time frame, the need to do it, because the reason for doing Framework B was to provide a traditional approach, and so that's basically, it was just a conscious decision on whether to undertake changing light water reactor requirements that are well established, or just leave them the same and rely on them, and that's the tact we took.
Thank you. Prasad, might you have any questions or that you would like to ask?
Yeah, I guess, Bill, the one thing I've noted following the developments, related to Part 53 and the public interaction is that whatever opposition has been voiced, I think in my mind, a lot of it comes down to what is the real flexibility allowed, because in your mind, the way you have described it, there is plenty of flexibility available throughout, but people on the outside who actually have to submit applications tend to think that there isn't as much flexibility as you have, I think, indicated in your description of the elements of Part 53. Now, I just want to point out that in NUREG VR 0303, the point is that this item of flexibility has been essentially translated into margins. That is, you can have flexibility if there is margin and you stay within margins. So I guess I would ask better definition of where the flexibility lies and how it can be used by applicants. But let's see, there was, I think, Adam Stein had a question, so let's move on to his question.
Yes, and there is also a question before that from Ed Wallace. I'm not sure if you want to do that one first, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Okay.
I thought Ed just said thanks, but go ahead, please.
You know what, there's a question mark at the end, so I may have misspoke. It's just said, great job on the last slide. There are areas in the work ahead to make Part 53 successful that industry in general and ANS specifically should consider to tackle areas of practice that are below the regulation and reg guide levels currently in the plan. So perhaps there's just more of a comment, the question mark not necessary.
The next one was Adam
From Bill.
Stein,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And he just questioned if Bill could explain the thinking behind the facility safety program. In particular, he said some have said that it may provide additional benefit to the applicant. How would that work?
Well, the thinking behind the facility safety program is that any regulatory structure, and especially one that's a whole framework like we're building here, is going to have a mix of things that the regulator basically does not want to provide any flexibility. Those that are flexibility is provided, but the regulator stays closely involved, and things that are the regulator can monitor. Um, and and the facility safety program was thought of in that last category of what is an area that the licensee is in the best position to do, and that is to assess the changing conditions around their plant. And so the facility safety program, modeled after other programs, basically said, you monitor the changing conditions and you assess whether any risk reduction measures would be appropriate. And given that those same licensees will be required to update the PRAs anyway, they would largely be doing that work in any case. And so the thought was, incorporate a requirement that we can then give credit to, and the NRC then can just monitor that that function is being performed. The function needs to be performed by somebody. So if the licensee is not monitoring for changing conditions and considering when risk reduction measures would be appropriate, then the NRC has to do it. So we have to have programs to look at what are the changing conditions around each plant. What are the generic safety issues that are arising? When might we need to undertake backfit assessments? When might we need to issue generic letters to say, hey, there's this issue and we want to make sure everyone is both aware of it and is addressing it, and tell us what you're doing. So all of those programs are in place to address new information. So the idea behind a facility safety program was again, given the work's being done by the licensee, can we give credit to them for doing it? Which, from a regulatory standpoint, we can only usually do if we give some recognition to it in the rules themselves. And then we might be able to take credit for that and reflect it in our assessment of operating experience and changing environments. So that was the idea. It really comes down to, it's a needed function. Who can do it best? So.
Okay, Bill, thank you very much. We've reached the end of this. I really, think you did a great job explaining everything behind the thinking of what has been published so far on Part 53. I guess we'll just be looking for the developments as the rulemaking process goes forward. In the meantime, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in to this community of practice session. And I just want to restate that we won't be having COP events in November and December. And I hope to resume our monthly community of practice sessions in January of 2023. So again, thank you very much for tuning in.